last Sunday of Advent. I invite you to join in our unison prayer for illumination into the miracle.
God, open our hearts so we are ready for the messengers you send to us. Help us to find your message in a world that needs it more than ever. Open our ears and hearts to the message of the angels. Be not afraid. Open our ears and our hearts to the angels' voices, calling to all who will listen. Do not be afraid. Amen.
Our Old Testament reading this morning comes from the prophet Micah in the 5th chapter, as we read from verses 2 through the first of verse 5. Hear God's word for us on this morning. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor bears a son, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth, and he will be our peace. Our New Testament reading comes from the Gospel according to Luke, as we continue to tell the story of the Nativity. This morning we read from chapter 2, once again, the first 7 verses. The birth of Jesus. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to him, to be married to him, and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloth and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. This is God's holy word for us on this holy day. Throughout Advent, we have been looking at the angel visits alongside Mary, then Joseph, and then, of course, the shepherds. And so today we head to Bethlehem as we are just days away from, once again, the Christ child being born. So I thought we'd take a minute to think about what Bethlehem looked like back in the day. And so I want you to think about, we might have a frame of mind of what Bethlehem looks like today through the news, but 2,000 years ago, what do we imagine that Bethlehem looked like? So I have a few statistics for us as we start to frame our minds of what Bethlehem was like. So you may already know Bethlehem is about 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem, and as we heard in Scripture, it is also part of the district known as Ephrathah in Judah. A small town, maybe not a little town of Bethlehem, but 300 to 1,000 members 2,000 years ago. It's a region known for its fertile valleys and hills. So we're not talking flat desert, we are talking hilly country. We also may know that it is the ancestral home of David and had been rebuilt and fortified through the years. King Rehoboam of the Old Testament is one of those that rebuilt Bethlehem. Any idea who some of the other people in Old Testament readings are from Bethlehem? So it was actually the original home of Naomi. You might remember even the book of Ruth and the stories of Naomi coming from Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth. Bethlehem is where Ruth and Boaz then made their home. Ruth and Boaz both being the descendants also of King David as well as Jesus. It also is the burial place of Rachel, wife of Jacob. And so there are markers today of her tomb there in Bethlehem. And then, of course, the most famous of the Old Testament figures is David. It is in the fields of Bethlehem where David was found by Samuel watching the sheep. It was also in Bethlehem where David was anointed to then serve as king, even though he lived most of his kingship in Jerusalem down the road. And then actually following the exile in Babylon, about 100 people, inhabitants of Bethlehem, returned home. So that would have then give some revitalization to that city. And then Bethlehem also was destroyed in the 2nd century. And at that time, some of the buildings and some of the churches were rebuilt and then again destroyed over time. So some of Bethlehem doesn't look at all like the Bethlehem of 2,000 years ago today. And then another interesting piece, not in addition to those hills and valleys, Bethlehem sits about 2,500 feet above sea level of the Mediterranean Sea. So hopefully you can start to get a picture of what Bethlehem might have looked like as we talk a little bit more about God's promise to Bethlehem. Oh, Little Town of Bethlehem is one of my favorite Christmas hymns, but I'm not sure it's a realistic picture of Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth. The city of Bethlehem, or House of Bread, lies within the territory assigned to the tribe of Judah, and we know that it lies not still like in the hymn, but in the midst of what was a very fertile country, and that's 6 miles just south of Jerusalem. The ancient city was beautifully situated on a commanding ridge, and as I mentioned, about 2,500 feet above sea level. The hills around it were terraced, and they were covered with vines, fig trees, almonds, and the surrounding valleys yielded good harvests of grain. Its population was small for those days, maybe that 300, at the tops 1,000. Not a big city, but not a still and quiet or little town that we might picture on the front of a Christmas card. Bethlehem had become almost a mythological place to us in so many ways. We see this tiny little town with a few buildings, a stable out in the middle of nowhere, a few huts, and maybe a sheep wandering around unattended. At the time of Jesus' birth, in the aftermath of the Babylonian conquest of Judah, the Jewish community was left without a king. It was a situation that would gradually put into place the rise of expectation for a Messiah to come and restore the Davidic dynasty. Bethlehem at the birth of Jesus was a city under siege by the Roman Empire. Today, Bethlehem is again a besieged city surrounded on 3 sides by a 25-foot high concrete wall. Within those walls are thousands of Palestinian refugees who lost their land, homes, and belongings back in 1948 when the state of Israel was established. They, like Mary and Joseph, came to Bethlehem seeking refuge. Many are still living in refugee camps waiting for a joint solution, waiting to be saved. If you think about it, Jesus was born as a refugee as well. Mary and Joseph were forced to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem. They had no choice but to go and be counted. Even an expectant mother in her 9th month of pregnancy was not exempt from being registered because she too was from the line of David. In the Roman province in which Bethlehem was located, women 12 years of age or older were required to pay a poll tax, and therefore they needed to register as well. Later, Jesus' family had to flee the brutality of King Herod and go into hiding in Egypt for a couple of years. So Jesus and his family were refugees then trying to find safety, a place to live, and peace without fear. Even for Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, there were fears and dangers. A little town of Bethlehem does speak to that, however. In the verse, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in the coming of Jesus tonight. That was the dream, the vision that peace would come to all people, just as the angels had said, and that the holy child of Bethlehem would descend to us, we pray. Ease out our sin and enter in. Be born to us today. So what if Jesus was born to us today in Bethlehem? For starters, if Jesus were born tomorrow night in 2018, he would not even be born in Bethlehem. Because today the city of Bethlehem is not in Israel, but in Palestine. And it is a bustling city of 28,000 people. Mary and Joseph would not be allowed to enter from the Israeli checkpoint, and neither would the Magi, even as messengers of the king, be allowed past the checkpoint. The shepherds would have been stuck inside the walls, unable to even leave their little town. So Jesus might have been born at the checkpoint, like so many Palestinian children today, while having the Magi and shepherds on either side of the wall. When we sing, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," we seldom think of the real city with the real people. But what happened in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago was something real. So where is the good news in all of this? God came into this troubled, wounded, and real world, born in a town like others under the powers of Roman rule. God is real and wants to enter into our real world with all its complexities and fears. Christmas is real. It's not a myth or a wonder world. And the good news is that God became one of us, one like us. God came as a baby, vulnerable and weak. And yet, through this child's birth, God was able to overcome the empire. Christmas is God's promise to us that we will have life, peace, and a future. For us, all the events in Bethlehem, the Christmas story of then, is our story today. We need to claim that story even in the midst of our own fears and doubts, because it is our story. We need to picture ourselves in the not-so-little town of Bethlehem and see this thing that has come to pass. We need to imagine Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, where stars were not silent. Matter of fact, they were about to announce the birth of Jesus, so they were beginning to shine brightly in the heavens. While we can believe that the dark streets were filled with God's everlasting light, they also were filled with many, many people. People arriving to be counted in the census, jostling one another as they move through the streets looking for guest rooms or homes to spend the night. And then there is the idea of silence. Even though the night was holy, it was nowhere near silent. Gospel writer Luke tells us this story for us to claim as ours. And he takes special interest in relating his narratives to events of world history, starting by naming Caesar Augustus as the Roman emperor. Caesar Augustus was the first, and according to many, the greatest Roman emperor. He ruled from 31 BC to AD 14, and he was one of the most powerful Caesars and expanded the empire to include the entire Mediterranean world. He transformed not just Rome, but the entire known world at the time with his roads and his armies. It was this exalted leader who decreed that a census was to be taken, which forced Mary and Joseph to leave Nazareth and travel to Bethlehem, Joseph's hometown, to be registered. Luke also names Quirinius, who was governor of Syria, and he served 2 terms in office, 6 to 4 BC, and then AD 6 to 9. So within the same time frame as Caesar Augustus. There was a census associated with each of his terms, and this is believed to be the first census, while these 2 introductions is the way for Luke to confirm the events of Jesus' birth on the timeline of history. The census, used for military service and taxation, was required of all citizens of the Mediterranean world, the empire at the time. Jews were exempt from Roman military service. However, they were required, of course, to be counted and pay their taxes. God used the decree of the pagan emperor to fulfill the prophecy of Micah. The prophet Micah's prediction is of a positive note, and it is a message to the region in which Bethlehem was located. It is a message that ultimately Christ, who will rule for God the Father from of old, from the beginning, long before his human birth, will come. The promise is this: Jesus' presence will be here within history and even from eternity. Israel will be abandoned, but only until the Messiah is born of God the Father and begins his rule. And the Messiah will shepherd and rule in the strength and majesty of God. These are words for the people of Israel, a salvation message of deliverance. Jesus is our peace, our Prince of Peace, Micah says. And his words are also quoted in part of Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, as King Herod then receives word that a king has been born to the Jews. And after asking the chief priests and teachers of the law where the Messiah was to be born, the words of the prophets were shared. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. All of this took place before King Herod ever sent the Magi to find the place where the King of the Jews had been born. So we find ourselves mixed in with the crowds, fighting our way like Mary and Joseph in search of a place to stay. Joseph, I imagine, was full of fear, anxiety, and worry, as Mary had traveled for days for them to finally arrive in Bethlehem, the city of their ancestor David. At least 3 days to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, but with overnight stops and times to rest. It is more likely that it was at least double that for Mary and Joseph. Traveling with the worry whether Mary was comfortable, would the baby come soon, even be born before they reached Bethlehem. They knew the dangers of traveling this route. Even with so many people making the journey, there were risks. Christian artist Christian Stanfield has a song titled Always that I think maybe better sums up the fear, the stress, even the tensions filling the streets of Bethlehem, and being held in the hearts of its people, especially Mary and Joseph on their journey. My foes are many, they rise against me, but I will hold my ground. I will not fear the war, I will not fear the storm. My help is on the way. My help is on the way. Oh, my God will not delay. My refuge and strength always, I will not fear. God's promise is true. My God will come through always, always. Troubles surrounding, chaos abounding, my soul will rest in you. I will not fear the war, I will not fear the storm. My help is on the way. My help is on the way. I lift my eyes up, my help comes from the Lord. As thousands were headed to Bethlehem to be counted, and some didn't even have family to stay with, or a family home is already stuffed full. So there are limited places to stay. Mary and Joseph certainly both had families still living in Bethlehem, but other family had traveled to be counted as well, and all the guest rooms were full. They would have also needed a bit more privacy. After all, a baby was coming. And have you ever looked for lodging in some strange city and found only no vacancy signs? Traveling along the highway but didn't know where you'd be stopping for the night? Or showed up at the motel that you thought you had registered at and discover that something happened and you are no longer registered. Sorry, we're booked, is all they have to say. Mary and Joseph were in a similar spot. They knew they had to be in Bethlehem. It was required of them both as descendants of King David. They didn't have a lot of time to plan ahead. As they arrive, they find that all of their relatives have full rooms and even rooftops. Some even have guests in the caves behind their homes used for storage and the animals. Besides, a woman giving birth would need some space, some quiet, a little privacy, and that was all in short supply. So there was no guest room, except maybe a quiet, warm stable next to the house. A room with straw and hay would do for one night. No one knew, not even family, that these were very special people and that the most earth-shaking event in history was about to take place in Bethlehem. So the not-so-little town receives the infant, Jesus born in a manger. The animal's feeding trough is the evidence that indicates that Christ was born in a stable. Very early tradition suggests that it was a cave, perhaps used as a stable either behind or below a home. For Christ is born of Mary and gathered all love, while mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. O morning stars together proclaims the holy birth. We hear the Christmas angels, the great glad tidings tell. Will come to us, abide with us, O Lord EMMANUEL. We hear the Christmas angels. One wonders if these are the same angels that the shepherds encountered filling the sky with their heavenly hosts, or Gabriel who visited Mary to announce the coming of the infant, now lying in a manger. Or is the angel God's messenger that came to Joseph in a dream, one of those that now announces the birth of God's one and only Son? Up until now, we have encountered angels with the message, do not be afraid. But once Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem, the only angels are in the heavens and visiting the shepherds out in the fields. The miraculous birth of God in a stable or cave in Bethlehem has no angel appearing with messages nor giving reassurances. We do not hear God's messengers speak. Do not be afraid. At Jesus' birth, we picture his mother wrapping him up, lying him in a feeding trough for the animals. But there is no fear. Perhaps this is where we find, finally, our silent night. God had a plan, and the plan was one we as humans could accept without being afraid. What would scare us about a newborn baby? There is no need for angels to comfort us or relieve our fears, because there are none. God's own Son was born to us in a form we recognize, that we can love and understand. It will be in the days ahead that the true mystery will unfold. For us, just like the Jews in Judea and Galilee, there is no fear in a baby boy, a carpenter's son, a man from Nazareth, or even a teacher. It is the man who has the power to work miracles, forgive sins, conquer death, and predict the future that confuses us. For this doesn't fit the picture of the Old Testament presence of God as a bright cloud, smoke on the mountaintop, or a pillar of fire. Jesus is both human and God, and his humble beginning will frame his story from this point forward. For the first time, ordinary people could behold God in a visible form. This baby born in a manger would be able to talk to anyone. His parents, a rabbi, disciples, a poor widow, anyone, without first having to announce, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid of your fears. They're not there to scare you. They're there to let you know that something is worth it. A quote by C. Joel C. For Mary and Joseph, and even the town of Bethlehem, the world would never, ever be the same. The events that unfolded on the crowded, not so silent streets of Bethlehem would change the world for us too. In the midst of all the fears, tensions, and stresses that night, over 2,000 years ago, God was with us in the living flesh. God tells us over and over again, do not be afraid. I am with you. Our fears are not there to scare us. They are there to let us know something is worth it. Our God's love is worth it. Believing in God's promise is worth it. Do not be afraid. God promises to Mary, to Joseph, to the shepherds, to Bethlehem, and to each and every one of us. Be fearless. God is with us every single step of the way. In Jesus, God is here. God is with us. May it always be so.